Have you ever seen a rough diamond being sold as a common stone? That's exactly what happens when we don't recognize the true value of what's right before our eyes. The seller thinks he's getting rid of something worthless. The buyer believes he's making an ordinary deal. But in reality, a precious jewel is changing hands for a fraction of what it's really worth. In the Old West, this analogy would become reality in a way that would forever mark the life of a lonely man. Jack Morgan had been riding for 3 days under the merciless desert sun when he spotted the small, weathered wooden tavern. The place seemed forgotten by time, with only a few mounts tied outside and the muffled sound of voices coming from within. He needed water, food, and perhaps some information about the next town. As he pushed through the swinging doors, Jack smelled the acrid odor of cheap whiskey and cigarette smoke. The atmosphere was shrouded in a twilight that barely let you see the faces of the few men sitting at tables. But it was a drunken voice that caught his attention, loud, desperate, and full of a sadness that made his heart clench. "Please, she's a good girl, works hard, doesn't cause any trouble." Jack turned toward the voice and saw a middle-aged man, visibly drunk, gesticulating at 2 well-dressed men who watched him with cold expressions. Between them, a small, fragile figure kept her head down, a girl who couldn't be more than 16 years old. $50 and not a cent less, said one of the men, adjusting his expensive hat. The drunk father hesitated for a moment, but the weight of debts and addiction spoke louder. "I accept." In that moment, Jack Morgan witnessed something that would change not only that girl's life, but his own as well. Because sometimes, recognizing a rough diamond at just the right moment can mean the difference between a lifetime of regrets and a second chance at redemption. What that lone cowboy didn't imagine was that his next decision would trigger a series of events that would force him to confront not only dangerous men, but also the ghosts of his own past. And you? Have you ever wondered how many times we lose the opportunity to recognize something valuable that's right before our eyes? Leave your like if this story has already sparked your curiosity about what Jack will do when he discovers who this girl really is. Jack Morgan had a golden rule he had religiously followed for more than 10 years. Never get involved in other people's problems. It was this philosophy that kept him alive in the Wild West, where compassion could easily be mistaken for weakness. And weakness cost a man his life. But something about that girl with her head down made all his convictions crumble like a house of cards in the wind. Maybe it was her shoulders that trembled almost imperceptibly, or the way she pressed her small hands against her worn dress. Or maybe it was the fact that, for a brief moment, when she raised her eyes, Jack saw there something he immediately recognized, the same silent despair he himself had carried for years. "Wait a minute," Jack heard himself saying, before he could even process the decision. His voice cut through the tavern air like a sharp blade. The 2 men turned, clearly irritated by the interruption. The taller one, with a scar cutting across his left cheek, stared at him with contempt. "This ain't your business, stranger." "I'm making it my business," Jack replied, sliding his hand instinctively toward his holster. $100 for the girl. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the drunk father stopped swaying and looked at Jack with wide eyes. The amount was double what the men had offered. "Interesting," murmured the scarred man, studying Jack with new eyes. "Very interesting. Seems we have here someone who recognizes quality when he sees it." It was at that moment Jack realized he had made a terrible mistake. The way those men reacted, the greedy gleam in their eyes, the calculating manner with which they now observed him, everything indicated that Sarah wasn't just an ordinary girl being sold to settle debts. She was something much more valuable and much more dangerous. After completing the tense transaction, Jack and Sarah left the tavern in silence. She walked beside him like a shadow, without saying a word. Only when they were far enough away not to be heard did she whisper her first words. "You don't know what you just did." Jack looked into those young eyes that carried a premature wisdom forged by suffering. "Then explain it to me." "They're going to follow us," she said simply. "And when they find us, they'll want much more than $100. The midday sun beat down mercilessly when Jack realized they weren't alone. It was a sensation. Every experienced man of the West knew well that tingling on the back of the neck that screamed danger, even when the eyes could see nothing but the empty horizon. "How many?" asked Sarah, surprising Jack with her sharp perception. "At least 3, he replied, adjusting the reins. "Maybe 4. They're keeping their distance, but they're there." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering courage for something inevitable. "I should have told you from the beginning who I really am. Now would be a good time," Jack murmured, forcing the horse to quicken its pace. "My real name is Sarah Blackwood. My grandfather ... he discovered something. Something that powerful men would kill to keep secret." Her voice trembled, but there was an iron determination behind the words. "When he died, I became the only person who knows where it's hidden." Jack felt his stomach drop. She wasn't just a girl sold by her father. She was a living key to something valuable enough to mobilize dangerous men across the desert. The distant sound of hooves echoing against stones confirmed his worst fears. They weren't just being followed, they were being hunted. "There's a narrow gorge about 5 miles from here," Jack said, quickly calculating the options. "If we can get there first, maybe we'll have a chance." But as he spurred the horse, one question hammered in his mind. What exactly had Sarah's grandfather discovered that was worth more than an innocent girl's life? The wind carried the increasingly close sound of their pursuers, and Jack knew they had little time before the chase turned into something much more deadly. On the horizon, dust clouds formed like storm omens. The truth was about to be revealed, but first, they needed to survive long enough for her to tell it. The rocky gorge offered the temporary refuge Jack had hoped for. Between the high walls of reddish stone, they managed to shake off their pursuers for a few precious hours. The echo of hooves had been lost in the distance, but Jack knew it was only a matter of time. While the horses rested by a small stream, Sarah finally broke the silence that weighed between them like a storm about to break. "My grandfather was a cartographer," she began, watching the crystal-clear water flow between the stones. "He worked for years mapping territories for the government. But 3 months before he died, he discovered something he shouldn't have seen." Jack adjusted his hat, paying attention to every word. In the back of his mind, something was beginning to connect, a vague memory struggling to emerge. There was a map different from the others among his belongings. It didn't show mountains or rivers, but something much more valuable: the exact location of silver deposits that the government keeps secret. Sarah paused, swallowing hard. Enough silver to finance a war, or by any man in the region. Jack's heart raced. Blackwood, that name. Where had he heard it before? "Your grandfather," Jack said slowly. "Wouldn't he be Edmund Blackwood?" The amazement in Sarah's eyes was all the confirmation he needed. "You knew him." Jack felt as if an icy fist had gripped his chest. 15 years ago, my younger brother was working as an assistant to a cartographer. He disappeared during an expedition in the north. They never found the body. "Tommy Morgan," Sarah whispered, and the puzzle pieces finally clicked into place. "Your grandfather wrote me a letter shortly before he died," she continued with a trembling voice. "He said that if something happened to him, I should look for a man named Jack Morgan. He said you were the only person he could trust, because you had also lost someone because of that damned discovery." The world seemed to stop around Jack. 15 years of guilt, of unanswered questions, of a pain he carried like an invisible scar. Everything finally made sense. But before he could fully process the revelation, the distant sound of voices echoed through the gorge. Their pursuers had found the trail, and this time they weren't alone. Does destiny really exist, or was it just coincidence that put Jack and Sarah on the same path? How do you think this connection to Jack's past will change everything? Leave your opinion in the comments. The sound of voices echoing through the gorge brought brutal clarity to Jack. There was nowhere left to run. The terrain ahead narrowed even more, becoming a rocky dead end. Behind them, at least 6 men approached, with the confidence of those who knew they had their prey cornered. "Stay behind the big rocks," Jack instructed Sarah, checking his weapons with precise, calculated movements. "Don't come out for anything. Jack, there are too many. You can't face them all alone." He looked at her with an intensity that made Sarah step back. In that lone cowboy's eyes, she saw something that went far beyond determination. It was the thirst for justice of a man who had finally found a chance to settle accounts with the past. 15 years ago, I couldn't protect my brother, Jack said, adjusting his hat one last time. Today, I can protect you. The men emerged from the gorge's curve like sinister shadows. The leader, the one with the scar, smiled when he saw Jack alone in the center of the canyon. Well, well. The hero wants to play duels, he mocked, slowly unwrapping the whip he carried on his belt. Boy, you have no idea who you're facing. Marcus Scar Donovan, Jack replied calmly. Killed 17 men, wanted in 3 territories, and responsible for my brother's disappearance 15 years ago. The smile vanished from Marcus's face. So you know who I am. That will make your death even more satisfying. What followed was one of the most intense confrontations those ancient rocks had ever witnessed. Jack moved like a ghost among the stones, using every shadow, every curve of the terrain to his advantage. His years of solitude in the desert had shaped not just a survivor, but a silent predator. The first man fell before he could even draw his weapon. The second tried to flank through the high rocks, but Jack had already anticipated the movement. One by one, the bandits discovered they had drastically underestimated the lone cowboy. But Marcus was different. When they finally stood face to face, Jack understood why that man had survived so long in the Wild West. He was fast, calculating, and absolutely ruthless. The final duel lasted only seconds, but each movement seemed suspended in time. When the dust settled, only one man remained standing. And Sarah finally understood why her grandfather had entrusted her life to that lone cowboy. The silence that followed the confrontation was heavy as lead. Jack remained motionless for long seconds, watching Marcus Donovan's body stretched out among the rocks. 15 years of revenge had finally come to an end. But the feeling wasn't one of victory. It was a deep emptiness he hadn't expected to feel. Sarah emerged from her hiding place with cautious steps, her eyes fixed on the man who had just saved her life again. But when she looked at Jack, she saw something that frightened her. Silent tears were running down the sun-weathered face of that cowboy who seemed indestructible. He was wearing this, Jack said with a hoarse voice, holding a silver chain he had torn from Marcus's neck. Hanging from it was a small locket, the same one Jack had given his brother the day Tommy left for his last expedition. The reality of that discovery hit Sarah like a punch to the stomach. Tommy Morgan hadn't simply disappeared. He had been murdered, and his own killer carried the last vestige of his existence as a macabre trophy. But what neither of them expected was to hear the sound of slow clapping echoing through the rocks. Very touching, really, said a familiar voice. From atop the stones emerged a figure that made Jack's blood freeze in his veins. It was the second well-dressed man from the tavern, the one who had remained silent during the entire negotiation. Colonel Harrison, Sarah whispered, recognizing the man who had been her grandfather's superior. Dear Sarah, Harrison said, calmly descending through the rocks with 2 other armed men. You've caused us so many problems, but now that Mr. Morgan has done the dirty work for us, eliminating Marcus and his troublesome men, we can finally close this unpleasant situation. Jack immediately understood the trap. They had been manipulated from the beginning. Marcus and his men weren't the real enemies. They were just disposable pawns sent to force Jack and Sarah to that gorge, where the real power behind everything could eliminate them without witnesses. The map, Miss Blackwood, Harrison continued, extending his hand with false courtesy. And this time, there will be no heroes to save you. But Sarah did something that surprised everyone. Instead of backing away in fear, she smiled. A smile that carried the same cunning that had kept her grandfather alive for so many years. Colonel, she said calmly, do you really believe my grandfather would be foolish enough to leave the real map with me? Harrison's face transformed, and Jack realized the game had completely changed once again. Sarah's smile carried a confidence that completely transformed the dynamics of that deadly confrontation. Colonel Harrison, accustomed to controlling all situations, for the first time in years, found himself facing something he hadn't foreseen. What do you mean by that? Harrison asked, but Jack could perceive the uncertainty growing in his voice. My grandfather was a very wise man, Colonel. He knew that one day men like you would come after the map. That's why he made several copies. Some true, others false. Sarah paused, watching desperation grow in Harrison's eyes. The copy you're so desperately seeking is buried with him, in Tombstone Cemetery, and only I know exactly where. The silence that followed was broken by something no one expected. Jack's low, hoarse laughter. He finally understood the genius of Edmund Blackwood's plan. He never wanted you to find the treasure, Jack told the Colonel. He wanted you to destroy yourself looking for it. And as a bonus, he managed to bring together the two people who had more than enough reason to see you dead. The realization hit Harrison like lightning. He had been manipulated by a dead man, guided like a puppet through a plan elaborated years before. All the pursuit, all the violence, all the wasted resources, everything had been orchestrated to lead him to that gorge, where there were no witnesses or escape. The final confrontation was swift and brutal. Harrison and his men, already worn down by the chase and now desperate, were no match for Jack and Sarah working together. She knew every stone in that region, and he possessed the necessary combat experience. When it was all over, Jack and Sarah found themselves alone once more. But this time, the silence between them was different. It was the silence of two people who had found something they didn't know they were looking for: a family. 6 months later, in a small town in Colorado, a cowboy who was no longer lonely was teaching a 17-year-old girl to shoot with precision. Sarah had decided she wanted to learn to defend herself, and Jack discovered that teaching someone was as rewarding as protecting them. They never searched for the silver treasure. The truth is, they had already found something much more valuable: the chance to rebuild their lives away from the shadows of the past. Jack opened a small blacksmith shop, using the skills he had learned years before becoming a wanderer. Sarah studied with the local teacher, determined to become a cartographer like her grandfather, but this time mapping paths to help lost people find their homes. And in the quiet nights of Colorado, when the wind blew softly through the mountains, Jack sometimes took Tommy's locket from his pocket and smiled. His brother was finally at peace, and he had found a new reason to wake up each morning. Sometimes, the best adventures don't end with treasures of gold or silver, but with something even more precious: a second chance to be happy. And you, which part of this journey touched your heart the most? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more emotional stories from the Old West.